Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you to the inaugural session of the inaugural History of Medicine Week. My name is Adam Biggs, and I am an assistant professor in the Department of Science and Technology Studies at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. I am also the chair of the Education and Outreach Committee for the American Association for the History of Medicine. And no, it's great to have you all here today. And I think this is really an exciting opportunity. History of Medicine Week sort of emerged out of a series of conversations that the Education and Outreach Committee was having, along with the AAHM Council, about ways we could build more meaningful connections between the history of medicine and communities that extended beyond and outside our familiar academic spaces. And so that's the theme for our week: broader audiences and meaningful engagement. And that's the topic that our panelists are going to be discussing today. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our moderator, and then we're going to jump right into the discussion. So our moderator for today is Dana Landress. And Dana is an assistant professor in the Department of Medical History and Bioethics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research examines the relationship between nutritional disease, community health work, and the political economy of capitalism. Her current book project is a history of pellagra in the U.S. South. And Dana, I'm really glad to have you here with us, sort of helping us kick this event off. And let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Adam. And hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here today. I'll offer special thanks to Dr. Biggs and Dr. Ashrafi, as well as the rest of the Education and Outreach Committee for AHAM for all of their work in organizing the inaugural History of Medicine Week. It is a terrific lineup we have for you. With that, it is my great pleasure to introduce our wonderful panelists, Dr. Lauren Small, Dr. Vanessa Heggie, and Dr. Jessica Martucci. Dr. Lauren Small is a writer and novelist with a PhD in comparative literature. She holds an appointment as an adjunct assistant professor in pediatrics in the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, where she co-teaches an elective in narrative medicine for pediatric residents. She has published 4 novels of historical fiction, along with 3 short stories, profiles, articles, and essays. Her most recent novel, The Eye Begins to See, tells the story of the Nazi doctor's trial and the origins of the Nuremberg Code. Dr. Vanessa Heggie is a historian of science and medicine in the Department of Applied Health Research at the University of Birmingham. Her research interests focus on the history of medicine and the biosciences and on environmental history, particularly topics relating to fieldwork, exploration, and human and environmental interactions. Finally, Dr. Jessica Martucci is the curator of the Barbara Bates Center for the Study of the History of Nursing at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research interests include the history of women and children's health, disability medical ethics, and the ways that power, marginalization, and identity influence the production and uptake of knowledge in science and in medicine. As a historian located in a nursing school, Dr. Martucci is also interested in the practical uses of historical methodologies, particularly archives and oral history, in healthcare education, research, and practice. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Small to begin our panel.
Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you to Dr. Biggs and Dr. Landress and to my fellow panelists for this opportunity to talk to all of you about the work that I do and what, if any, role it might be able to play in this question of broader audiences for the history of medicine and meaningful engagement. So I'll start, first of all, just to tell you a little bit more about myself. As Dr. Landress pointed out, I am not a historian. My background is in comparative literature, but I would count myself as a lover of history and someone who believes very strongly that history plays an invaluable role in our ability to understand the present. The work that I do through my historical fiction centers on social justice for marginalized communities. So I have written stories that have encompassed history of Native Americans, women, people of color, people suffering from mental illness, victims of fascism, and medical war crimes. I've written about all of these in novels that offer a blend of historical fact with the imagination. And my hope is to bring history alive to my readers and therefore to be able to cast a light and a better understanding on the present of current injustices. So how do I understand the intersection of history and fiction? There are a few things that I think are evident, or at least so I see it that way. The first one is that history is a narrative. That is to say, it is a story that we craft about the past. The second point is that someone is telling that story, and that person will always have a point of view, partially known perhaps, and sometimes unknown to the audience and to the person, even to the teller themselves. And finally, I think the way I see it is a teller of a tale always has an agenda, which is just another way of saying they have a reason to want to tell their story. So we look at those three things, and in that way, I would argue that rather than saying that history and fiction somehow stand on opposite ends of an argument, I would rather think of them as parts of a continuum in which any storyteller, whether it's a teller of a historical account or a fictional account, is going to have to make choices about how they frame their story, what elements they choose to include, what they decide to leave out, what they want to emphasize, and of course, most importantly, how do they analyze and interpret the information that they are presenting through their story. So in this context, what can historical fiction do? Now, the things I'm going to mention here are things that I believe all good historical writing will do to some lesser or more extent, but that historical fiction maybe has a special ability to address these issues. One is that historical fiction can lead us to embrace nuance, contradictions, ambiguities, and uncertainties. And in this regard, I think it was F. Scott Fitzgerald who famously said that a novelist is the person who can hold two contradictory ideas in their head at the same time and not somehow go crazy. Good historical fiction can engage the reader through dramatic storytelling. And this, I think, is particularly important in our topic this week of broader audiences and meaningful engagement. It's particularly, if it's well done, is particularly well suited to immerse readers in particular places and times. As writers of fiction, we are taught to engage the senses of our readers and to really think about bringing a particular place alive. We can use art to stimulate the imagination and to engage our readers. It's almost like cooperative storytellers with us. We can give insight and context to personalities and events. As a writer, I think that my topic is all things human. We can show how the past resonates with the present, and we can invite the reader to learn more about that particular topic. So when I write historical fiction, I view myself as having obligations to my readers. My first obligation is to research, and research. And like I said, I'm not a trained historian, but I do, through my PhD, I've learned how to research and how to use credible sources. I need to be able to navigate contradictions and uncertainties in the historical record. I imagine that's something that all historians have to work with. And something that, again, I think probably all historians have to somehow grapple with this. I need to be able to figure out how I can remain faithful both to the history I'm trying to tell, but also craft a good story. So I always include in my books an afterword. And in the afterword, I identify the key sources I have used in crafting my story. I clarify what is evidence-based and what is purely imaginative. And I often give the reader advice as to where they can look if they want to learn more. So in conclusion, to answer the question of what can historical fiction do in this context of broader audiences and meaningful engagement, I kind of view what I do as opening a door. I want to open a door. I'm going to invite the reader in. We're going to engage in a meaningful conversation about the past and hopefully be able to draw some conclusions or better insight from that about the present. Thank you.
I think I'm up next. Yeah. I just wanted to say Thank you for the invitation. And again, thank you to the panelists. I think we've got a really nice range of expertise here. Mostly what I'll be talking about is engagement with perhaps more traditional media, so newspapers, but also podcasts, TV shows, films, documentaries, that sort of thing is where a lot of my engagement and outreach work has been focused. I will confess that I got into it first entirely by luck. I was in the right place at the right time in the middle of my PhD and was asked to take part in a BBC radio documentary on the history of vegetarianism, almost at a point where I was kind of too young and naive to know any better, that it didn't seem like that was a strange thing to do. So it helped boost my confidence without me really having to angst and worry about engaging with the media in that way. And I think it was then two further things that really helped and facilitated my participation in engagement work. One was that I actively sought out all the training and all the opportunities I could. If something came up, I would sign up for it in forms of engagement work because I found that I really enjoyed it, particularly writing and speaking to more general audiences than just academics. And secondly, and I think this is the crucial point, I am a terminally online person. I have been online since the birth of the internet. I was blogging and message boarding and tweeting and tumbling and getting in the first tranche of Facebook and the rest of it. And I think partly that has really helped me practice new forms of writing and practice engaging with sometimes hostile audiences and audiences that are coming with very different assumptions about the things that I want to talk about. But I think it also helped me network way beyond my sort of small in-person group and to talk to a much broader global audience and make connections. So I was already blogging and tweeting about the history of science and medicine when the Guardian newspaper in the UK put out a call for new science bloggers. They wanted to join their science journalism department. And it was a mutual friend on Twitter, Rebecca Heggie, who approached me and suggested that we should say to the Guardian that they needed some humanities perspectives on science as well. And she works more on the history of the physical sciences and on the early modern period and is a museum curator. And I do more sort of life sciences, medicine, modern periods. We thought between the two of us, we had enough coverage that we could really suggest something to them. They fell for our pitch and they accepted it. And for about 5 years, we churned out at least one post a week of somewhere between 500 to 1,000 words for The Guardian that was tied in some way to something that was in the news cycle. It was a unique opportunity. For one thing, we had extremely little editorial oversight in terms that we could choose what we wanted to write about, which is quite an unusual experience, I think, for writing for news media. If we thought it was going to be libelous or problematic, we did have to run it past some of the internal teams. But otherwise, we basically had direct access to the Guardian's journalist portal and had lots of conversations about how not to delete the front page and things like that when we uploaded our blog posts. And I'm flagging that because I think that's a very different sort of engagement to the usual one we have with the media, where the direction of the work is more driven by the journalists. They're sending queries to you rather than you necessarily sending queries out to them. This was more, I think, perhaps like traditional academic blogging, where you're writing about what you want, where you're responding to events in the outside world. But although it's atypical, it did teach me quite a lot about working with journalists, about working within the news cycle, about the highs and lows of this sort of public engagement work, and particularly about being a relatively public figure, particularly a woman talking about science in certain spaces. And it also opened a lot of doors. It's definitely a case that once your name gets out there, you do get more offers of this sort of work. I still, even though we stopped doing the column about 7 years ago, I'm still getting queries from media outlets who directly respond to things I had in The Guardian like 10 years ago. And I'm therefore getting, consults for TV shows, for Netflix series. I've been a panelist on various, mostly BBC radio programs, interviewed on podcasts, and obviously interviewed for more traditional news media. And a lot of that has followed on from the profile I got from The Guardian blogging. I am happy to answer any specific questions people might have about these particular experiences, but I am going to flag that I think both the media and the outreach landscapes are quite different where I'm based in the UK and possibly for the rest of Europe than they are in North America. So it might not be the specifics of my experience that are most relevant. So instead, I tried to boil down 3 more sort of generic take-home points I thought might be useful. And I think the first one is that it's quite crucial that you find out what you're good at and what you actually enjoy doing in the media and engagement sphere. And I think that particularly in places where outreach and engagement might not be quite as institutionally or culturally embedded, it can be very easy to get very focused on certain types of activity, for example, talking to journalists, and ignore all of the other opportunities and potentials that are out there for engagement activity and for talking to alternative audiences. So, for example, I am quite happy to perform. Okay, I like large crowds. I don't mind talking to them. I love new topics. I like being asked to come up with something. I don't generally get writer's block, and I respond well to external prompts. So if someone says, I'm going to draw something out of the blue here. If someone says, okay, we need a 1 hour lecture on the history of buttons in science and medicine for the Department of Trade, that is my dream job. That is exciting. I'm immediately thinking, I don't know anything about the history of buttons, but I guess all buttons are gendered because you button things up different ways around if it's male or female clothing. You have fake buttons on medical devices to make people feel better. Brilliant. That's 2 topics already. I'll get there. That'll be an hour. That sounds really exciting to me. I appreciate that for some people, the idea of having to do something like that is the absolute nightmare scenario. They can't think of anything worse. And I think that's great because we all have the different skill sets and the niches that we fit into. And I know that some people they have real passion projects. You're researching something that you know is important and relevant, and you really desperately want to get your personal project out there. Don't necessarily want to react to what other people are asking for. And then knowing that about yourself, I think is really essential. I think that's important. You don't want to turn down opportunities by saying, oh, I don't think I could do public speaking. It's always worth giving it a go and seeing how it goes for you. But I think it's really important to know you don't have to do everything. Media and outreach activities should be fun, and failing that, they should at least give you a sense that you are doing something important and rewarding. And if the stuff that you're doing gives you neither of those things, then that's time to start thinking about maybe you should be doing something else, or you should be trying a different approach. So that's the first, is that you don't have to do everything, but there will be something that you really enjoy and is valuable and important and rewarding to you. And I think second and third are what I consider to be the 2 biggest hurdles of working perhaps with the more traditional media. One of them is imposter syndrome. And that is becoming comfortable talking about things that aren't your specific area of expertise. And again, this is something I think some people never get comfortable with. And I think that's also fine if you want to talk about your particular research interest where you are the world expert and that's what you'll talk about, that's fine. But there are more opportunities to share if you are willing to speak more generally about ideas from our discipline. There are boundaries. So I still get things that are clearly science queries. I will get journalists saying, we want to know what genes make you a better athlete. And I have to say, well, I can tell you what they thought in the 1970s, but I cannot tell you what the actual answer to that science question is today. So you do have to draw some boundaries. But some of the blogs we wrote for The Guardian, or I wrote for The Guardian, were about medieval and early modern medicine. I'm a 19th and 20th century historian. But the fact is that for the general science blog readership of The Guardian, I am enough of an expert in medieval and early modern medicine to be able to write something that's informative and research-based and actually interesting and useful and provocative. So there is this aspect of imposter syndrome and how comfortable you are speaking outside of what you feel like is your particular field of expertise. And journalists will expect you to stretch that kind of to the limit sometimes. So it's important you know where your boundary is. And I think the second biggest hurdle is the culture shock of working outside academia to entirely different timescales, but also entirely different cultures of work. The speed that journalists need stuff is very clearly different to perhaps more slow paced churning out of articles and coming up with opinions about things. So that's a fairly obvious conflict. But I think there is also a difference in other cultures. The one that comes up most often is in cultures of credit. So how much acknowledgement, how much credit you will actually get when an article is published or when a TV series airs. And I think here, the important thing is to find people you can talk to within your institution or within the society or through sourcing people on social media who can help you to understand what the cultures are in those particular media in which you want to work, so that you understand what's reasonable to expect in terms of things like credit and timelines and payment from people who are writing a policy paper or a journalist who's writing an article or a Netflix series who are asking you to consult. Because I think that can really, that setting the expectations and understanding the cultures is a really important feature for having a satisfactory engagement with the media. Like, they don't do a great job at understanding how we work. So I think sometimes the pressure is on us to do a better job of how it is that they work. So yes, it's find what you're good at and what you actually enjoy. The biggest hurdles are imposter syndrome, setting your boundaries, and then finding ways of understanding the cultures of work in the spaces that you want to engage with and to speak to. So I guess those are my 3 take homes.
Great. Thank you to my fellow panelists and to Dr. Biggs and Dr. Landress. I'm Jessica Martucci again. I'm the curator at the Barbara Bates Center. And just to give a little bit of background on what the Barbara Bates Center is, if you don't know, and then a little bit more about me and the work that I do. So the Bates Center is an archive and a center for research, education, and collaboration in the history of nursing and healthcare at Penn Nursing. And we have one of the largest archival collections that focuses explicitly on the history of nursing. And we offer fellowships that help bring researchers to access our collections and a whole host of educational programming and research support activities that we offer at the center. So I'm here to talk about, being a historian situated in a history center like this at a nursing school. And I'm very interested in finding common ground and building bridges between history and nursing in this role, because that really is the point of the position of the curator here, is to increase access and engagement between the nursing school and what the History Center has to offer. So as a result, I've been really intrigued by thinking about ways that academic history might not always be the best tool for doing this kind of bridge building work. And I've been exploring more creative and accessible ways for my community to encounter history and engage with it. So I've been looking into all sorts of different kinds of programming, having a book club that features nonfiction or maybe possibly even fiction writing. Lauren has sort of convinced me of the importance of medical fiction, medical history and fiction. Oral history, which is something I'll talk a little bit more about. And then more traditional forms of public history that I draw on in my work, like traditional, in-person exhibits, digital exhibits. We did a walking tour last year. That was really fun. And then this past year, I also started a program where we select a nonfiction book that features like really decent historical writing on healthcare, preferably featuring nurses. And we bring that author to campus and we sort of, advertise that book. Last year, we brought Sarah Di Gregorio to campus, who has a really well done book on the history of nursing called Taking Care. She's a journalist. It's very well researched. She cites historians throughout. And this year, we've decided to bring Maria Smelios to campus to talk about her book, Black Angels, which talks about the story of the Black nurses at Seaview Hospital who were involved in the care of tuberculosis patients and the development of the tuberculosis treatment. And, these events have been very well received in the community, and people are, coming up to me and telling me about how much they've enjoyed reading these books. And for some of them, I know these are probably the first history books that they've probably, books about history that they've picked up in a while. So I feel like these sorts of efforts are really important just to kind of lay a foundation of interest and trust that history is there for everyone to participate in and to have access to. And then it doesn't have to be this sort of walled off, the archive can be a very formidable place that is not always the most welcoming to the uninitiated. So another thing that I've worked on is building an archive-based project called History Lab, which History Lab is a phrase that gets thrown around in other contexts as well. But the lab part helps, again, sort of with the familiarity across disciplines here. But this is a project that takes place over the course of a fall, a spring, and a summer semester for a master's program. And students are generally, they're studying in the context of this particular track that they're doing this project in, leadership. And so the program is interested in developing nurse leaders. This is a master's program. And so the archive project that they're going to be working on this year is focused on studying the life of a particular nurse leader who had a lot of relevance at Penn, Claire Fagan, also a lot of relevance in nursing more generally. We have her papers. So this is an opportunity to engage students in the archive using archival materials. They're doing work that looks like the work that historians do, but they're doing it for a totally different professional focus. So these are just some of the things that I've been working on and thinking about. I'm interested to hear questions from others that may have been thinking about some of these things and excited to talk more with my fellow panelists.
Fabulous. Thank you all for that. I think there are a lot of places we can kind of go. And I know I have a couple of questions to start with. Dana, do you want to maybe start us off?
Sure. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our panelists for their fantastic presentations. I wanted to ask each of you if you would be willing to reflect a little bit more about engagement with different genres of audience and what that looks like, be it engaging younger audiences, maybe in the context of young adult fiction, engaging nursing students who maybe have not taken a history class in many years, perhaps even since high school, and then engaging with general public audiences in the space of a newspaper or an online blog. So I'd be curious to hear more about how you think about your respective audiences and the kinds of questions you ask as you're thinking about the presentation of particular historic narratives to very different valences of listeners, readers, and engagers. Thanks.
Well, I guess I can start since you mentioned young adult fiction. I've never written it. I made an attempt once and I was told that it had too many words. It turns out that publishers will they don't even need to know what you're writing. If you say this is a young adult novel, they'll just look at the manuscript and say, too many words. So I didn't quite reach that. But I did write my first published novel which is about the Sand Creek Massacre, does have a teenage protagonist. And I felt that it could play a role maybe the way that if some of you grew up or know To Kill a Mockingbird, the role that novel has played among high school students to bring certain questions about history of race in our country. And so I thought this might be a good opening for it. But yeah, I mean, young adults, they're definitely, if you're writing young adult fiction, it definitely has its own requirements, which I don't need to go into now. But I would also say that in general, the topics that I take on tend to be heavy, rather difficult, and not necessarily suited to younger readers. So I guess that's my non-answer to your question.
I found this conversation sort of really interesting because oddly, from a UK university perspective, what we do teaching like nursing students and medical students history would not count as engagement for the work that I do. It would have to be an external academic audience. It hadn't even occurred to me to think, oh yeah, I do talk to medical students and nursing students. That does count. That is an important audience. So I guess that my focus has been more perhaps on the general public, which doesn't exist. And I'm always telling my students not to talk about the general public. And when we're filling in grant forms, you can never talk about the general public. It has fallen out that the audiences I talk to tend to be either scientists or science literate or science curious people. That seems to be the niche that I have fitted in the media landscape when I'm doing more, like obviously when journalists are asking for a comment on the Olympics or something like that, it's going to a very different sort of audience. But when I'm asked to give sustained material to something like a column or a blog article or a TV show or a podcast, it's generally going out more to scientists, and I'm there as sort of the humanities voice. And I like that. My first degree was a science degree. It was in genetics. So I'm quite confident talking technically about some of these aspects, which I think really helps. And I can cross between those two fields. But I also feel quite passionately that that communication is a really important skill set for scientists to have as well as historians. And if I can do things to facilitate that, that's really useful. But also that I'm quite keen to show the connection between the disciplines, that it isn't STEM versus arts and humanities, that we are one enterprise trying to make the world a better place, and to show the ways in which there's synergies and connections between that. So I think this is the audience I found myself talking to, but it's also the one that I really want to speak to. Age-wise, I have done some work with schools and younger people. I find that a little bit more difficult because it does need to fit in with the school's curriculum, and staying on top of that when you don't have kids of the right age can be quite tricky, because in the UK, I don't know about the US, but it changes about every 3 or 4 years and you've no idea what it is they're supposed to be studying or how their maths is supposed to work. So I find that actually there's a lot more churn for younger people, and trying to connect to them, trying to know what the buzzwords are, trying to understand what they're doing at school, what they're watching on TV is actually much harder. I think I'm too lazy to really speak to a younger audience and to keep up to date with that. I'm better off at sort of, older adults, middle-aged science fans and science curious. It seems to be where I've played out.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I would say in terms of my primary audience really is within, Penn nursing, but then I'm also interested in, building connections and keeping us visible across campus and as part of the wider community at Penn. We're connected through the Penn library system. So, that's a whole constituency there as well. So, there's various different groups that I'm always sort of thinking about and trying to sort of balance across our different programming. When I'm doing like an in-person exhibit, like, for example, I'm planning one that's going up in November. It's being coordinated with the school's celebration of Veterans Day or Remembrance of Veterans Day. So it's a military nursing exhibit, but it's also, it's going to be very visual. Mm-hmm. We've got beautiful art and, wartime recruitment posters, provocative postcards depicting, nurses in sexually stereotyped ways. So I think there's a lot of like visual engagement with something like that can appeal and is sort of easily accessible as students are sort of walking to visit their professors' offices, or, it's also a way to bring the wider community into our space and help them become more familiar with us so that we, again, are sort of more welcoming. And then, some of the outreach that we do, like, it's interesting that you were saying, Vanessa, that you didn't think of like working with the students as engagement. That's a big part of my role is finding ways to engage with the students because they don't have required history courses. So it's, how do we think about getting history to these students who are incredibly busy? They don't have free time. So if you're offering like a lecture at the end of a day, like, they're probably on their clinical rotation and they're not going to be there. We do try to make every sort of, speaking event or anything like that hybrid so that we can record it and make it available afterwards. But even then, how do you encourage engagement with that material once it exists? And so there's just, I've found, finding ways to work within the curriculum with specific faculty. Where is there space to kind of bring a historical perspective into the conversation? And I think it's not so much a matter of like convincing people that history matters, because especially in healthcare, I think people are inherently interested about, the history of their own field and discipline. But it really is a matter of like, how do you find sort of the space to do that, because there's so, at least in nursing school, it's so heavily scheduled. There's really very little room for like electives or extra things for them to take on. So it's really about, I think, knowing your audience and figuring out what are the very specific, sometimes, ways of kind of communicating with them. And, again, coming from like a curatorial perspective and like a library perspective, everything is built around like access and how do you make things as easily accessible as possible so that they're not costing anyone additional time or like intense labor or effort to find the content or the material or, whatever it is that you're producing. And so that's a big part of what I focus on too, is just sort of how can we make engaging with history as low of a lift as possible in some ways, and yet still have it be meaningful and impactful.
And I mean, I think it's kind of really sort of a fascinating thing to hear you all talk about, in some ways, how like our educational structures actually inhibit, the dissemination of history, in ways that we would think would be very kind of purposeful and very meaningful. I have like three things I want to sort of touch on that I think you all have each raised, and maybe each of you can kind of speak to. That is to say, Lauren, you sort of started off talking about the tensions you talked about the desire to deal with complexity, right? But I'm also kind of wondering, like, this is often like one of those conversations that goes on between journalists and academics, where academics say, oh, it's more complex. And we may hear journalists say, well, we need you to kind of simplify this in some kind of way. And I just wondered, like, to the extent that there is a tension there, how do you find yourself sort of navigating that space? And I think that's for everybody. The other question that Vanessa kind of brought up was you mentioned, the propensity to encounter these hostile audiences. And so how do you sort of also navigate, whether that's within the academy or beyond it, hostile responses? And then, so, and Jessica, I'm almost kind of hearing this from you in terms of the idea of like developing the history of the history lab, which I think that's actually a great idea for a number of reasons, but also sort of moving away from academic history. Does that sort of lend itself to some type of, dare I say, like abolitionist approach to the study of history, which is to say, like, are we sort of saying, or is part of what you're saying, that the structures that we currently have to that sort of delineate legitimate history, so to speak, or academic history, that they inhibit its dissemination in ways that maybe we should really be serious about rethinking?
Well, I can definitely talk to your first point, the desire to deal with complexity. I'm so glad I wrote that down. It's such a great way of putting it. I think it's something that historical fiction really is uniquely suited to, because I don't have to decide, so to speak. So, for example, my last book, The Eye Begins to See, which is about the Nuremberg doctors' trial, and I decided I wanted to write the story of Dr. Leo Alexander. I had various reasons for wanting to do that, who was the chief medical counsel to the American prosecution at this war trial, and also a principal architect of the Nuremberg Code, which I think you would all know is the basis for all of the rules and regulations that govern human experimentation that are enforced today, but that arose out of the Nuremberg doctors' trial. And what I really wrestled with was how to craft the story, but also how to bring in. I was interested not only in Dr. Alexander and what his motivations and thoughts may have been, but also the people on the other side. So the doctors who had been accused of medical war crimes. And I was able to get a lot of information about Karl Brandt, who was the chief physician to the Nazi regime. But I really struggled with how to present Karl Brandt, because on the one hand, I didn't want to humanize him, because I felt that what he had done had been and overseen had been really so horribly inhumane. But on the other hand, I did want to humanize him because he was human. And I felt it was important that we understand that these kinds of things arise from human beings, in many cases, normal human beings, a man who was dedicated father and husband and so on. And so I ended up writing the book partially from his point of view. And that was quite a leap for me to do that, and quite a leap of the imagination. But I felt it was very important exactly for this reason that you're saying, because I wanted to present the complexity of the situation. That in a lot of ways in my work, I don't write villains. I don't believe the world is full of villains. I think the world is full of good people who end up doing bad things for various reasons. And we can look at that. So maybe that's something that fiction can do, is that say we're going to get into the mind of Leo Alexander, but we're also going to get into the mind of Karl Brandt, and we're going to look at both of those things, and the reader is going to read them and encounter them, and then have a discussion or a thought process about all of that. And I think that's something that maybe fiction is more suited to, perhaps, and to do. So I really like that phrase, and thank you for asking that question.
I think that I'll take the two together, because I think hostility and complexity are actually sort of flip sides of the same coin sometimes. I mean, if I start with this question of hostile responses, obviously, if you put ideas out there, and particularly if you are a woman in public, there is going to be a certain amount of pushback from the usual suspects. Aside from the stream ends of things, I think the best way of dealing with this is to do your research in advance. That is, if you are going to be writing for a particular publication, or even if you're just going to be talking to a journalist from a particular publication or news organization, please find out what sort of stuff they normally publish. Look at the comment section that's there. Look at their Twitter account or their Blue Sky account. Check this journalist out and understand that. Just don't go blindly into these spaces. I think it's really important to understand what you should be expecting back once you contribute to this particular space. And some of it is about setting boundaries in advance for yourself. Like, you can choose to be online when the article launches, or you can go and read a book in a cafe for a couple of hours until it all blows over. Those are options available to you. I mean, other than in the most extreme cases, stepping away from the computer for a day or two actually means you don't see a lot of the most hostile stuff and it stops being problematic. So I think some of it is about setting your own boundaries in exactly the same way you would say stay in any online space. And some of it is making sure that you have a supportive community, whether that's the university comms office or whether it's just your friends that will be there for you if you feel like you're putting something out there that might attract particular sorts of hostile attention. And I think we all know what those particular push button topics are. There are always going to be people who will go like, and I got this pretty much every week we put up a science column, there will be somebody going, how dare a woman know something about science? And you kind of, that's sort of hostile stuff that you kind of get used to, sadly, after a while. But I think the flip side for the complexity issue is that for me, the most hurtful hostile commentary was from peers. It was from people saying, why is Vanessa writing about early modern medicine and fertility in The Guardian? She doesn't know anything about it. Like, because I don't know about it. Again, this is understanding where your audience is and where they're at. I'm not talking at a medieval conference about fertility and history of fertility. I am talking to someone who maybe stopped studying history at 16 and really likes science. And for that person, I am able to do the 101 introduction to blah that is sufficient for them. And I think some of this is actually about giving our colleagues a bit of slack if they get misquoted in the newspaper or if you think they've dumbed down something. I'm thinking a little bit about exactly this, because I'm drawing a bit here from being a book reviews editor for a long time as well. The worst critique is this book isn't what I wanted it to be. It didn't tell the story that I particularly wanted to hear. Like, who was the audience that person was trying to talk to? Did they do so effectively? Give them the benefit of the doubt for it. So I think some of the hostility comes from us, and that we could do a fair amount to back down a little bit on that.
Yeah, and Adam, I'll kind of focus in, I think, on your comment and question about History Lab and sort of, moving historical practice away from academic history, because this is a question that I've been thinking a lot about, and I think it's really interesting. I don't have any answers. I don't know if anyone has a resolution to this, but I think that my perspective, again, I've had a bit of a interdisciplinary journey myself. I have a background in the natural sciences. I came to history very late as an undergraduate because I was doing an environmental studies, like interdisciplinary degree, and I had to take an environmental history class. And that was like sort of my entryway in. And so, and maybe this kind of touches on the complexity question as well, because I think that, when we teach undergraduates, and I remember, being an undergraduate in that environmental history class, we don't, the degree of complexity that like we get as you like go through a PhD program, it's not comparable, right? But it's enough to engage you. It's enough to teach you something, give you a new perspective. And so I think, we have to keep that in mind too, that like we can't, with these engagement efforts, it's not ever going to be the equivalent of a 6 or 7 year long PhD program. But, that's kind of what our role is, right? Is to sort of be able to look at a very complex situation and say, this is the thing that I think matters in this context, or that I would like for you to know in this particular moment, or that I think is particularly relevant to you based on your perspective. I mean, that's, I think, the kind of decision making that happens when you do any kind of like public history exhibit, right? You have to decide, or even write a lecture, right? Like what is the 1 or 2 takeaways that we want people to come away from this with? And I think that can actually sometimes then inform like our own perspectives and like the kinds of questions we ask as researchers. And again, just to like tie this back into the History Lab question, I think that for example, in developing this History Lab, learned about a whole like research question that I didn't even know I wanted to ask, that is now something that I'm pursuing as my own research interest, about the sort of this one particular way in which Claire Fagan changed hospital visitation policies. Not something I would have ever thought I would be researching if I hadn't been doing that particular engagement work. So I think in that way, it can fuel academic history. Flip side is, what being in a nursing school and seeing that actually, nursing is such a, in many ways, interdisciplinary field that has borrowed and built on methods and tools from sociology and public health and epidemiology and all of these, health sciences. And yet history and the methods of history have kind of been walled off from that. So what does it look like if we allow or create space for our methods to travel? And what are the implications of that? I'm starting to kind of think about those things, but I think they're really interesting.
And it really does sort of convey this sort of tension, I think, between, what academics tend to be invested in, which is this element of sort of performative expertise versus this sort of connection with curiosity, right? And the thing that sort of motivates us from a professional framing is like being able to perform a certain type of expertise, but that's not necessarily what larger audiences or audiences outside academia tend to be invested in when it comes to actually learning. It's like, Lauren, you brought this up. It's about like asking questions or leading people to kind of be more curious about whatever the subject or the topic is, which is sort of an interesting maybe tension there.
And I think we have one question here from the audience in our Q&A, which is a question pertaining to modality and maybe also related, sort of on a related topic, a question about compressed timeframes and news cycles when we're talking about the sort of planning of a project, which happens in a really different kind of time frame than, let's say, putting together a monograph or an academic article. So this question comes to us from Barbara Hertz. And Barbara wants to know if you all have any insights about pitching to television shows, in particular CBS 60 Minutes. This particular pitch would be related to a history of precision oncology and really interfacing again with a general TV audience regarding the current uses of radiopharmaceuticals. But I think we can also take a moment to reflect just generally about this kind of question about both the time frame for pitches and the kind of different modalities that we would all be working in. Thanks.
Shall I kick us off on this one with the media question then? That timescale for projects. So I think this, for me, this ties into the question about doing your research and picking your projects and being confident, I think, in saying no as well as yes sometimes. That it is absolutely fine to turn down a journalist query if you can't come up with an answer to a question in 2 or 3 days, or to email them and say, give me a week if you got a week. Like, these things are nearly always negotiable. It's very rare that they actually need it the day they ask it for. You can always ask for more time for some of these things. So I think the process of engaging with the media is a negotiation. You can ask for things back. You can push deadlines and things like that. So don't be afraid to ask, because worst case scenario, they just never answer your email and then you move on to the next thing and it's fine. One of the things I'm quite happy doing performances and writing. I hate doing random Zoom calls without prepared questions to journalists. That is the thing that I like least, mostly because I find that they haven't done their research on me and they want to ask me science questions and we've both wasted our time. So what I was saying, finding the thing you do and don't like, the thing I nearly always say no to is if a journalist emails me in the morning and says, can you jump on a Zoom call today? I never can. I am never available for that. I will always give them the option of emailing me pre-prepared questions and coming back to it. But that's not a thing I do. I have colleagues who love that stuff and they'll do it all the time. So again, the timescale is something you can ask for. And if you're not comfortable with it, then you don't do it. There was a second part to that question and I've already forgotten where we are. About pitch, I will pass on the pitching to TV because I don't know anything about 60 Minutes because I'm British. I'm going to use that as an excuse, I'm afraid. But I will say that opportunities will come to you more if you already have a profile. Again, the number of times when I've done something small, I've just written a blog post for the university's press office or something like that. And that is why the BBC have come to talk to me about something. And I think if there are things like press office lists, mailing lists, Women Also Know History, a group you can get into with a database that journalists can search and find people with particular expertise, opportunity builds on opportunity. So starting small is often quite a good way to actually have whoever the 60-minute people are reaching out to you and asking you proactively if you'd actually like to offer something to them.
Yeah, I would just build on that. Again, having no personal experience pitching to 60 Minutes or any television shows. But I will say that at one point, work that I had done went sort of viral in not a good way. And some of my work ended up being featured on some television programming on Fox News. And I will say that the way to get onto television would be, I think, to start smaller. So I would say like my work started with just, an op-ed in a local newspaper. And, if there's a way to get an opinion piece into a local or regional paper, that's always, I think, the first place to start, especially if it goes well, then it could always get picked up by increasingly larger outlets.
Lauren, did you want to respond to that one also, or
I thought it was obvious that I know absolutely nothing about it. Sorry. No, I mean, I think, people who write fiction also need to think about marketing for sure. And in general, I think that the best advice is you start small. What Vanessa said and what Jessica said, you start small and get things out into a local publication that you have a connection to, presumably, and then it can get picked up, or then people will start approaching you and you can build on that. And at least as far as marketing books, that certainly is a model that seems to work best.
And we don't have like more sort of room to have dialogue with the person asking this question as well. So I guess there's some context that maybe that we're missing from that too. But one of the things that sort of started, or the impetus behind the theme for this week, was the maxim that platforms like television often reach many but touch few. And the idea that, that I hope we can continue to explore, and that I really appreciate you all exploring today in really meaningful and pragmatic kinds of ways, is how we form meaningful connections, right? How do we touch people outside of our current academic and familiar spaces and our networks? And I feel like this is just a fantastic start to a week that I am looking forward to. There's several other sessions that are taking place for the rest of the week. I hope our audience members can come, and I hope that our panelists can also come and take part in some of these as well. And I just want to give everybody really a hand of applause, and just to say thank you all for coming out and for making this really work so well. Yeah, Dana, is there anything that you want to sort of close off with?
No, I think that was so wonderfully stated. Thank you so much again, just to reiterate to our panelists. And I think this question about meaningful connection and meaningful collaboration is something that will be a theme throughout the rest of the week. So I just once again encourage all of our listeners and our audience members to join into the wonderful panels that are happening later this week. And thanks everyone again for being here today.